Thank you everyone for joining us for yet another wonderful week to learn more about the next stage of Emile. And so without further ado, Professor Jensen.
Thank you very much, Kim. And again, thank you for all of the arrangements.
Oh, Pam, I think you muted yourself inadvertently.
Okay, am I back? We're discussing book 3 today, and I think that the subtitle for book 3 might be simply enlightenment, as distinct from the Enlightenment, because Rousseau still seems to preserve his criticisms of the actual Enlightenment. And yet he is occupied, the tutor is occupied with the intellectual development of Emile. Rousseau calls this the most useful part of the whole book. In this, and I think we could find it very modern, because it tracks with our own understanding of education, especially education in the sciences. It's about method. It's reliant upon the use of experiments, not on books. And it is the only chapter in the whole book that is devoted entirely to the education of the mind, with the exception, of course, of political science, which is taught near the end of the book. John Dewey was very influenced by this chapter, as you might imagine. And if you look at schools of education, you will find a number of them that read the Emile, and this chapter is again given priority. One of the main points of the education in book 3, I think, is how we can enlighten a person, how we can teach the natural sciences, how we can lift the veil on nature, without triggering the desire to know for the sake of distinction, for the sake of being recognized, for the sake of some kind of reward other than study itself. Rousseau says we must not trigger amour propre. Amour propre, I think he could define as the form of self-love that arises when we begin to compare ourselves to others. And naturally, we want to put ourselves in the first place, but that doesn't always happen. And so along with comparing ourselves to others comes a form of self-love that gives rise to rivalry, competitiveness, jealousy, pride, vanity, envy, all the rather unpleasant emotions that, could exist. So Rousseau wants to avoid triggering amour propre in the course of teaching Emile. Another sort of phrase that we could use to summarize book 3 is that Emile is learning how to learn. And that's an expression that we also use quite a lot. In the Republic, to which we can compare Emile every once in a while, the first education given to the young guardians who are discussed is mainly moral education to instill in them a proper kind of character. And it is not until later in the Republic that the guardians are exposed in any way to philosophy. Rousseau seems to invert this. And at the end of book 3, he says, we have created an active and thinking being. And now to complete the education of the man, we only need to create a loving and a feeling being. That is, as he puts it, to perfect reason by sentiment. So the moral part of the education, the loving and caring part of the education, which takes a decade in the course of the novel, that all occurs starting in book 4. Again, the tutor says he's not so much interested in filling Emile's mind with knowledge, but in giving him a taste for loving the sciences and the means to proceed, the methods to proceed when that taste is better developed. This is the shortest period of Emile's life. Rousseau calls it the time for labor, instruction, and study. The peaceful age of intelligence, middle school age, which I'm not sure teachers in middle school would necessarily agree. Last time someone had asked about the relationship between nature and history, and I just wanted to use a sentence or two to kind of clarify what I should have said then. If you wanted to define nature in the strictest sense, Rousseau says you are referring to the original dispositions of human beings. But those original dispositions almost instantly begin to change because we have to learn things in order to survive, physical things, mental things, and so on. And therefore, in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau expands somewhat the definition of nature to refer to the equilibrium that exists in natural man between his faculties or resources and his desires. So there's a balance. Whatever he needs, he can get. And in Rousseau's conceit, natural man is self-sufficient unto himself, self-sufficient. And therefore we can imagine him living alone. Okay, so if natural man or Emile at this stage is still a person in balance, he doesn't want more than he's able to get. Rousseau says, in fact, when you think about the teenager from 12 to 15, you're talking about a being who has a surplus of faculties over what he needs. His needs are small and he can get them very easily. His passions are calm. And as there are these continual little storm warnings, these ominous rumblings in book 3 about what is to come, the onset of puberty, and how that could upset the entire apple cart. But for now, we don't have to deal with that. We can use the surplus of faculties that Emile has to prepare for the future. So Emile is at the moment a very strong being because you have to think of it in relative terms. His needs are less than his capacity to meet his needs. That, I think, is important in the sense that, according to Rousseau, he has all this extra ability and he can use it now. He can develop some foresight. He can develop his skills. And even though the purpose is not to make him into a scientist, but into a judicious human being, there's so much that we can do, but time is short. And in addition to that, Emile is only permitted to learn what he really wants to learn. And there's never any constraint. It is up to the tutor to give birth in Emile to the desire to learn X, Y, or Z, and then to give him the means to satisfy that desire to learn. And there is a proper order in which to learn the sciences. And many of the sciences are relegated, in a sense, to either a later time or they are removed entirely, because Rousseau continually says all of the vain sciences, all of the things that could make you an artist, all of the things that are, well, not that Emile is immune to the beautiful or the value of art, but that all of the things, there's so many things which people are esteemed for, or which people study so that they can be esteemed or recognized by others. These are not studies of true value. So Emile is presented with many, many objects on which to exercise his mind, but those objects are all of material concern to him. Rousseau says that curiosity is the motive of the age in which we are, of which we are now concerned. And this curiosity is natural to human beings. We have a natural curiosity concerning everything that may have a connection to our interests, whether that is far, such as seeing what's happening in the heavens, or whether that's very near, such as geography or the topography of your county or something of that nature. We are curious about those kinds of things. And so regulating that curiosity, igniting that curiosity, and maintaining it is an important part of what happens in this book. As I said, Rousseau continues to keep up the drumbeat of attack against the Enlightenment. And I think we are led to think about the signature project of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, namely the Encyclopedia of Arts, Sciences, and Trades, of which Diderot and D'Alembert, both friends of Rousseau, were the editors. Rousseau himself wrote 400 articles for the Encyclopedia on music, but he criticizes it, and he criticizes it in a way because it shows us that science is a great vast sea, a bottomless sea. And if you go into it unprepared or without some yardstick to help you figure out what to choose to study and what to leave behind, you're going to end up like a child gathering shells on a beach and ending with none because you just lose sight of them. I mean, first you pick up some and then you leave those and pick up others. And then, you know, in the end, you're floundering. And so Rousseau says you have to be careful about lifting the veil on science. And it reminded me a little bit, what his argument reminded me of the last book of Gustave Flaubert, which was published posthumously. It is called Bouvard and Pécuchet. And it's about two, I can spell that, Bouvard and Peccuchet. These are two clerks in an office. I think they're actually copyists. They make fine copies of contracts and things. And they're 47 years old and they decide they want to get an education. And so they spend all of the rest of their lives reading through books and compiling lists and trying to pass on this knowledge to others. And they never make any progress. But at the end of book 3, Rousseau says, Emile has a precise and unprejudiced mind. He truly owns all the knowledge that he has. And he, sorry, just look for notation here. He has a mind that is universal, Rousseau says of him, not by its learning, but because of its faculty to acquire learning. And With the method that I have used in book 3, one advances little, but one never takes a useless step, and one is never forced to go backward, so that one can see the true foundation, a solid foundation on which knowledge is based, and then whatever is needed, Emile is in a position to find. Rousseau also says of Emile, I never permit him to go too far in any given science. Now, I just pin this thought somewhere and keep it in your mind. If we were dealing with someone like Albert Einstein or Marie Curie or Susan K. Johnson, Katherine G. Johnson, I just saw this yesterday in the movie Hidden Figures, it would not be possible for you to hold them back. In fact, they would go on without you. And I think it's important to recognize that this education, which allows Emile to become the creation, in a sense, of the tutor, of an ordinary mind, may have its ultimate limit, because Emile does not push against whatever limits the tutor establishes for him. But he is judicious, and he knows how to get science when it is needed, and truly understands, and can remember all of the things that he has learned. There is, says Rousseau, an order of the sciences which is available to philosophers or scientists. Hobbes provides us with such an order. He gives us a diagram of how all the various sciences fit together. And D'Alembert, Jean D'Alembert, mathematician, wrote a book called The Preliminary Discourse to the Encyclopedia, in which he also establishes a tree of knowledge and shows how all of the sciences are interrelated. Of course, there is a little bit of a sly aspect to D'Alembert's preliminary discourse, because he wants to poke various authorities, clerical authorities and others, in the eye. But there is this is the chain of knowledge of which scientists or philosophers, with which they are familiar. But Rousseau says there's another chain that most people use, and that you have to use with children. One particular object attracts another and shows the one that follows. So it's kind of like a magnet, which is very important in book 3. So one object attracts another, and it is by means of a constant curiosity that one begins to pay attention in the way that all of the sciences demand. So there is an order in which they are to be learned, and it operates like a magnet. And in book 3, a rank ordering in terms of priority of the various arts and sciences. So we need to maintain a constant curiosity in order to go from one study to another, or from one experiment to another. And Rousseau says curiosity is the hook. Curiosity is the motive by which we are going to control Emile, or have a hold on Emile, in book 3. And the way to do that, with respect to the fact, since we are curious about things in the heavens and things very near us, the way to do that is to offer, to utilize a standard of utility. That if you can show that what you want to teach Emile is pertinent to his interests as he understands them, not the tutor's interests and not some authority's interests, because we don't defer to any authority. But if you can do that, says Rousseau, you will always be able to move him. There is an experiment, a wonderful experiment that is discussed, which I will talk about in a minute. And in that experiment, a duck by a magnet. And you could say that Emile is a little bit like the tutor's duck in this section of the book. Now, our natural curiosity, which takes us out of ourselves into the heavens or right in our neighborhood, is very important for Thomas Hobbes, who had written that the natural seeds of science and religion are the same, because we are curious about causes of our own well-being. Now, in Hobbes's world, the reason why we're curious is that we're anxious, always anxious about the time to come, whether it's the future or the afterlife. You know, we're afraid of the loss of our life, and we might also be afraid of the powers that are invisible. And so Hobbes says that most human beings could be called Prometheus, whose name means forethought or foresight. Who was Prometheus? Well, you know, he was punished for discovering fire by having his liver gnawed to pieces every night. And every morning when he woke up, he could look forward to that happening again. So he lived in a kind of 24-hour dread or pain. But in Rousseau's case, Emile doesn't have that anxiety. He is going to learn a little bit about foresight, and Rousseau says it's very important to human misery or human happiness if you can control the amount of foresight that you actually have. But with Emile, we can use the objects of sense to entice him to want to know things. And furthermore, these objects of sense you can begin to awaken his desire to learn by making him attentive to the phenomena of nature. So, for example, to look at the setting sun or to look at the rising sun. And Emile and the tutor spend a lot of time outside, and there's no urgency presented in their conversations. It looks like a kind of game. But Emile can be made to want to learn it if you are prepared to answer this question: what is it good for? So Rousseau says that's our watchword. What is it good for? And it's an important question for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it gives Emile a real interest in knowing what he's going to learn. And secondly, and this is equally important, from the standpoint of the teacher-student relationship, it's extremely helpful to be able to have a break on the child's constant peppering you with questions. Why is the sky blue? Why does rain fall? Why is the top spinning? You know, all of these kinds of questions. And to be able to do it without actually angering the child. But Rousseau says if there is at one time when the child twigs to the fact that you're trying to fob him off with a simple answer or a smooth answer or something along those lines, all is lost, because he won't rely on you anymore, and he's going to try to get you, going to try to scrutinize you again. And so the theme that we saw in book 2 is present even more so here. The relationship between the tutor and the student must be kept in a certain balance as well. So what is it good for? That's the question. And Rousseau also admits that when he wants to stop Emile, or when he isn't sure how to reach Emile, he will simply say, I don't know, and move on to something else that seems more entertaining at the moment. And Rousseau tells us, I pretend to have more faults than other masters or tutors who try to hide their faults. I have more credit for never being in a position to try to push the questions away or to call them silly or to, to just not deal with them. I never look impatient. And I think that this has something to do with Rousseau's whole self-presentation, that in his writings, he does appear to have more faults than in fact he may actually have. And this is an important thing to keep the teacher-student relationship. In all of their experiments, they don't use books. Rousseau says in this chapter, I hate books. Author of many books, I hate books. And I'm going to get to another reason for his hating them in a moment. But while they are looking at ways in which they can orient themselves by the sun, because they've studied a little bit about the rising sun and the setting sun, and Rousseau has taught Emile the geocentric theory of revolution of the planets. The Earth is stable and the rest of the planets move around the Earth. The sun and the rest of the planets move around the Earth. Rousseau also tells us that the sun is the most striking object to human beings because the island of humankind is the Earth, and the sun is the most striking object on the Earth. And then he says, the philosophy of almost all savage peoples, as he uses that word, almost all primitive peoples, turns on imaginary divisions of the Earth and the divinity of the sun. Now, Rousseau clearly is not replicating those understandings. In place of the mythical or poetic or religious understandings, Rousseau is clear, clinical, and cold, simple, clinical, and cold, as he says, and he wants to show Emile how to study astronomy, cosmography, but also geography, beginning with the geography of one's neighborhood. And so, again, a real foundation for science is being laid. They're dabbling on the basis of trying to find a way to orient themselves by the sun. They're dabbling with magnets, and they don't really know what a magnet could be good for. They're just kind of playing around with it. So Emile has not yet asked the question. But while they are doing it, they realize how a magnet works. And then as it happens, they go to a fair. And in the fair, there is a magician who is called the magician Socrates. And this magician holds a piece of bread in his hand. And with this piece of bread, he can attract a wax duck to do whatever he wants, to come this way or to come that way. He simply does it with a piece of bread. And how, I'm not quite sure, but the tutor and Emile divine how this trick is done. So they go home and imitate the magician. And they decide that very night, since Emile is all abuzz with his newfound knowledge, that they're going to go back to the fair. And Emile tells the magician, this isn't much of a trick, I can do it. And then, since he's holding a piece of bread in his pocket, which is surrounding a magnet, a little iron magnet, he moves the duck in exactly the same way. And everybody claps for him, and the magician says nothing, but there's this huge applause, and the magician makes very much of him and says, please come back tomorrow so I can gather an even bigger audience for you and you can show your tricks then. So of course, Emile can barely sleep, He wants the whole world to be there to see his glory. They go back to the fair, and he takes his little piece of bread surrounding with the iron in it, and the duck refuses to come his way. In fact, the duck turns the other way. The duck flees, the duck runs, the duck swims away. I forgot to say that the duck was in a little tub of water. And so Emile is caught up short and made to look like a fool. In the meantime, the magician has shown that he can make the duck move when somebody else slices up a piece of bread, or when he just takes it from somebody else. And he can even use his own voice to make the duck follow him, to make the duck do pirouettes. But poor Emile, no matter how much he tries, nothing is going to happen. The duck does the opposite of what he wants. So Emile is now humiliated, very humiliated, wounded, in fact. And well, they were planning to go home and have a party. They now go home covered with disgrace and just totally ashamed and embarrassed. You can imagine Rousseau admires this example or holds it up as an example. If you want to avoid this vanity, this amour propre, this feeling of pride at what one knows, it's very helpful to have mortifying consequences follow upon the first example of it, such as Emile believing that he can outdo the magician, which of course he can't. And so, but you could also say, I mean, I'm sure you're thinking this too. I mean, if you humiliate a child about something, you might turn him against the very curiosity, the very studies that he was engaged in that led to this humiliation. So we can't just leave it there. And in fact, the next day, and this has all been set up by the tutor, the next day, the magician comes over to the house, and they're ashamed to see him. They're hanging their heads. And he says, I'd like to show you the trick, which perplexed you so much yesterday. And I mean, you could say that this magician is called Socrates for one reason, because he debunks other people's claims to wisdom, false claims to wisdom. Socrates questions them and shows them they really don't know anything. They only seem to know something, but in fact, they don't. So the magician Socrates says, I'll show you how it's done. And he proceeds to explain to them how it was done. There was a child underneath the table at the fair, and the child moved the duck with a bigger magnet, whichever way the magician called for. So there's nothing magic about it. It's a simple use of magnetism, but it enabled the magician to do whatever he liked. And in fact, he says, I don't know why you would be so determined to win glory at the cost of an honest man's subsistence. Look, if I could do something else, I would do something else, but I can't. This is my job. This is my profession. And of course, I've been studying it for my whole life, so you can't possibly think that you could best me on it. You know, this is just what I do. You're just a novice at this sort of thing. They are so thankful that they try to pay the magician, and he, like Socrates, does not take money for his lessons. Says that's, you know, there's generosity in every station, and this is mine. And then in front of Emile, the magician calls the tutor over and says, when your charge is grown up, he is going to criticize you for not warning him about things before he fell into mistakes. You have a job. You are experienced. You are the tutor. You should warn him before he falls into these kind of mistakes. that's set up too, because what Rousseau says is, now I have another little hook on Emile's heart and mind, because by my desire to warn him before he falls into mistakes, I can in fact guide him when I see him going in another direction. I have the sanction of the magician. The magician invites them back to the fair. And this is another respect in which I think the magician is like the actual Socrates, because, or he bears some resemblance to the actual Socrates, because philosophers, according to the actual Socrates, are not always comfortable in society. People think they're useless, or people think they're vicious. And therefore, it's important for the philosopher to have friends in the society. And this magician has found a way, a Socratic way, by sharing his understanding with Emile and with the tutor. As the magician has found a way to make a friend who can help him, to ensure that people who are not necessarily philosophers will not hate philosophy. And so when they go off to the fair, they're now going off to the fair as, in a sense, co-conspirators. And Rousseau says, if Emile had opened his mouth after seeing all the wonderful things that, or not so wonderful things that the magician can do, if Emile had let on a single thing, he would have deserved to be annihilated. And this is one of many instances in Rousseau's writings where finding a way for philosophers to have friends is maintained. Okay, so let me turn to what I think is the second theme of book 3. Not only are we learning the methods by which we can learn the sciences, we are also being treated to some information about books. The illustration for book 3 is an engraving of Hermes, who is shown engraving the elements of the sciences on a column, on a concrete or stone column. And Rousseau tells us in a little paragraph that begins, "I hate books," that he associates Hermes with the invention of writing. Hermes is oftentimes connected to the Greek god, I don't know how to pronounce this, Teuth, Theuth, who supposedly invented writing. And so, and Socrates talks about that god in his dialogue, the dialogue that Plato wrote called Phaedrus. Now, Socrates didn't write any books, but he must have known that Plato was going to spend his whole life writing books about Socrates. So in a sense, even though Socrates didn't have to write books, because Plato was writing a book about the Socratic dialogue. So we have this Hermes, and we have Rousseau's association of Hermes with books and writing. And Rousseau says, we don't need books. All we need is, if you want a monument to engrave knowledge on, the best monument of all to engrave human knowledge on is the human head, is the human mind. And then it will be preserved by tradition. But, that's a little bit iffy. And for a scientist, tradition doesn't have, it could be like that game telephone. I mean, as science is not necessarily a respecter of tradition. So 12 lines after Rousseau says, I hate books, and Hermes is a writer, and we don't need writers, etc., etc. Rousseau says, 12 lines later, Well, if we absolutely must have books, or since we absolutely must have books, there is one in my mind which is perfect. It is, in fact, the most felicitous treatise on natural education ever written. Is it Buffon? Is it Aristotle? No, it's Robinson Crusoe, the novel Robinson Crusoe, of which I have a child's version here. I don't know if you can see it, but Robinson Crusoe, Rousseau says, well, of Robinson Crusoe. In this one, he's holding a gun, and he's reading the Bible inside, and I don't think that is a part of I don't think that that is a part of the Robinson Crusoe that Rousseau wants to teach. I also wanted to share something that I've had hanging in my room since 2007. I don't know if you can see this, but this is an example of a woodcut made by Mario Nunez Whalen, who was a student in Emile, in an Emile class, and whose senior art show included doing illustrations in woodcut of the Emile. And this is the one representing book 3, Robinson Crusoe, and I've always loved it and have it next to my desk. So if we absolutely must have books, we must have books. We're going to use Robinson Crusoe. So the question is, why do we need books in the first place? What are they, and why this particular book? And I think to summarize, Rousseau gives some examples of failed experiments that he undertook with a child. And they failed because, does the child want to know how ink is made? Well, Rousseau certainly would want to know how ink is made, but a child wouldn't necessarily want to know this. So there are these failed experiments, and Rousseau says we must again think of something that the child can find that is, in his palpable interest. And furthermore, the study of Robinson Crusoe, Emile doesn't so much study the book as he uses it as a script or a prompt book, as if he were a Boy Scout wanting to earn his Eagle badge. He is completely enthusiastic and involved in Robinson Crusoe. He wants to be Robinson Crusoe. He thinks of nothing else but Robinson Crusoe. And according to Rousseau as tutor, he is more ardent to learn than the tutor is to teach. It's almost impossible to hold him back here. And so you could say that we have found something to raise and intensify Emile's curiosity. We have found something. Why do we need something like that? Well, according to Rousseau, the answer is simply because Emile has few needs and can meet them very, very easily. He has to work as hard as a peasant, think like a scientist, in order not to become as lazy as a savage. That, in other words, Emile's curiosity requires a stimulant, and this is the stimulant. But it can't be a stimulant for his curiosity or for his effort, for his resolve to put forth effort. It can't be one of those things that will trigger amour propre. Because if you think about it, I'm just imagining sports of any kind, the best stimulant for putting out effort in sports is competition, comparison, rivalry. That's very, very helpful, even necessary in sports. But Rousseau doesn't want to ignite that kind of self-love. And so he says, as soon as Emile can reason, no more competitors, no more companions. When he doesn't want the cake at running, but the prize, the recognition, all of that is off the table. The only thing he can do is to compete with himself, to consider himself relative to what he was, in the years past. But that may not be enough. So we need a stimulant. We need something that can persuade him, not just convince him like the failed experiments do, but persuade him, speak to his whole being, arouse passion, arouse and use his imagination for the first time, because Emile has not ever been taught to make believe. So this is extremely important. And one of the things that he says, it's very important then to give Emile this stimulant for his curiosity, and to give him, in fact, an imaginary rival, not a real rival like the tutor, because that rivalry is very much in danger of getting started. So we don't want a rivalry between the teacher and the student. The teacher has never even tried to run with Emile. I mean, that was out. I mean, he stands aside. But we don't want, on these intellectual grounds, for there to be reasons for the student to engage in a kind of rivalry with the teacher or with anybody else. So Emile is given an imaginary rival. And with respect to that imaginary rival, Rousseau says, I want him to think that he is Robinson Crusoe. I want him to examine his hero's conduct, to see if there was anything that was omitted and what could be done better, to note Robinson Crusoe's failings, so that Emile is, on the one hand, identifying with him, and on the other hand, he is elevating his own critical thinking by finding things wrong that Robinson Crusoe did. So the only other, I'm going to have to stop here, but the only other thing I wanted to say, or I should say before stopping, is that as if a father were listening to Rousseau talking about Robinson Crusoe and the time spent on this novel with the little boy or the teenager engaging in make-believe, I mean, you could say that Robinson Crusoe, the most felicitous treatise on natural education ever written, is in a way the young teen Emile's Emile. I mean, this is something that grabs him, grabs his attention, and keeps it. But if there were fathers listening, as if there were a father listening, Rousseau introduces a critic of this whole approach. The father is saying, my son is not going to live in an imaginary order where things that are truly valued are valued. I mean, this is reality. And he makes a complaint against model cities, imaginary orders, we might even say imaginary republics, like Plato's Republic. And it reminds me of Machiavelli's criticism in chapter 5 of The Prince, in which Machiavelli says, look, the way people live is so far from the way they should live that this is a waste of time. You are wasting my child's time by teaching him about this imaginary order. And it is as if the parent is saying, what is your book good for, Rousseau? I mean, as if someone might say to a prospective Kenyan student, what is liberal education good for? And woe betide the college that cannot answer the question. But of course, I have always thought that Kenyan really did answer the question beautifully. But so Rousseau has to give some sort of reason. And the reason that he gives is that the parents are thinking, we have to learn to use these madmen in society as means to our own ends. I mean, that's what he should be studying, men in society and how to manipulate them and how to get them to go along with what you want. And Rousseau says, no, what you want is to teach him to be a leader of human beings, not to be like them. And in order for him to rise up above prejudice, it is necessary for him to have a standard so that he can go from opinion to the truth, so that he can truly know the truth. And then you can show him the madness of human beings. But first, you must give him a model. You must give him a standard. And the study or the practice of Robinson Crusoe is the way in which he tries to do that. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we will go on to book 4 next time, and I will take any questions if we have a little time.
Sure. We have a first question here. How can we understand the great care and attention Rousseau gives to the subject of the relationship between the tutor and Emile when viewing the book as in part a political project?
Okay. Well, in his last comment, Rousseau implies that Emile is going to be, in some sense, a leader. That he is going to be able to understand how to guide human beings, other human beings. He's not going to be trained to go into the academy. And at this point in his life, Rousseau says he might even trade all of the academies that exist, all the academies of science. He might trade them all for a pastry chef, but in whom he values much more. So Emile, the time that is devoted, to the relationship has something to do with how different the next stage of the education is, the next stages of the education is, and how, with respect to our education, how Rousseau guides us. I mean, the question, I think, will be, where do we think Emile is headed? Could he work in a democratic society? Could he become a leader or a politician? That is the question. And I think that are a larger relationship. And at the same time, Emile must be kept close to the tutor in order for the rest of the education, which Rousseau treats as the most serious parts, to work. I hope that's at least a beginning. Any other? Questions?
That was the only question we received in the chat, so you must have just done such a wonderful job
Oh,
explaining that
I
there were no
don't think so.
other
I don't think
questions.
so. I did say that there was, the one thing, okay, I'm going to just add one more thing. Before we leave book 3, Emile has not only learned how to make his way in the sciences, he's also learned how to make some scientific instruments that may be more crude than the ones that you could find in a store or made by an expert. But he has also learned a trade. And I think that is an important part of book 3, because it shows that there is always a moral meaning to the things that Emile is doing, because the reason for learning a trade, according to Rousseau, is, well, Emile may lose his father's land, he may lose his inheritance, and he has to find a way because this is an age of revolutions. But I think that that's a pretext. The real reason seems to be because we have to overcome the prejudice, conquer the prejudice that teaches us to despise trades. And so we have to pick a trade, and the trade Rousseau says, I'm not going to pick for him, but if he doesn't have any strong inclination one way or another, and there's a whole array of decent trades out there, I would like him to be a carpenter. And so that's the trade they choose. Now, what is so great about carpentry? It's clean. You can practice it at home. You have to be fit in order to do it. It requires skill in industry. It's not like an assembly line. And it's not like being a miner or being a blacksmith or being a shoemaker or being something that is kind of offensive to the senses, a butcher. You know, it's not that kind of thing. In fact, although it is intended for utility carpentry, and Jesus was a carpenter, the fact is it can take into account, Rousseau says, elegance and taste. And that is in this last part of book 3 that leads us into book 4. I think that's an important factor. The fact that it's clean and it is not forbidding to girls. I happen to like Forged in Fire, the television show, and I've seen women win making knives on that show. One of whom was a farrier, and she, you know, just excellent at doing this kind of work. And I don't mean to, I mean, Rousseau would keep women away from that sort of thing. But in this context, the idea of being a carpenter, if a young woman walked into a carpenter's shop, she wouldn't be shocked. Her senses would not be offended. And that's going to turn out to be kind of important for Emile. Okay, so I will end here, and thank you very much for your attendance, and just email me if you have another thought or question. Do you have a question, Genevieve? Oh, anybody? Okay. All right. Thank you. See you next time, I hope. Thank you. Bye-bye.